Good evening, everyone. Uh, Due to popular demand, we're redoing this thesis. So many people weren't able to come. We have an audience of 3 people here today. Woo! And we're going to go through the thesis so everyone at home and abroad can enjoy. So let me screen share first. That is important. Share. Okay. All right, so the title is Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Federalism's Role in the Failure of U.S. Passenger Rail Development. So when you get on a train, or have you ever been on a train? Let's raise our hands. Who's here? Okay, 3 for 3 in the audience. Who here has been on a train that's been delayed 10 minutes or more? Wow, only 2 out of 3. And how many people have been on a train that's been canceled outright? So, 2 out of 3 people in the audience, a lot of Americans who take trains have been in very similar situations. Our trains are pretty unreliable, they're very slow. You can't really go that far with them. You can only go to some locations. And this is a big limitation when it comes to rail development. But it wasn't always like this. Even in the very decline of passenger rail service in the 1960s, we had a lot of passenger rail all over the place, up and down the Northeast, in the Midwest, all the way to the Western United States. We had rail development everywhere. Rail travel. But despite billions of dollars being invested into rail development programs for the past 50 years, we've come to this. So in the past 50 years, we've actually lost track for use for passenger rail by half. In terms of the frequency, we've had less frequent service. From going from coast to coast, it's only about once a day. Even up and down the Northeast, it's very limited. And in certain corridors, like in the Midwest, we've gotten rid of services altogether. It's even worse when we compare ourselves to other nations. This is in terms of high-speed rail. China blows us out of the water, our main rival, but even smaller nations like Spain, Japan, France, Germany have better high-speed rail networks than us. Even the country of South Korea, which is roughly the size of Indiana, has more high-speed rail than us. When we look at true high-speed rail, which is speeds of 150 miles an hour or more, the comparison between the United States and Europe is just as bad, if not worse. So in Europe, they have very intricate networks of high-speed rail connecting cities and countries. And then here in the United States, we only have 2 small portions of track between New Jersey and Boston. And this is not good. If we want to be the global superpower and we want to be the global economy, we have to actually facilitate the rail development to create that economy in the first place. And I'm here to ask, before we get to that, the title of this film, this thesis is Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, which is based off this movie with John Candy and Steve Martin. And they kind of travel across the country using all these different forms of transportation. And one of the forms of transportation they take is the train. And they take it from Wichita to Jefferson City. But fun fact, when this film was made, that train line didn't even exist. That's how bad our trains are. We have to make up fake train lines to actually fill plot holes in movies. So not really good. So I'm here to ask the question why. Specifically, why has passenger rail failed to grow in the United States? And what are the unique challenges that rail projects face in the US? And my hypothesis is federalism. Specifically, to quote my thesis, America's decentralized system of federalism, where local, state, and federal governments must act in a coordinated fashion, is the key challenge that makes rail development so difficult in the United States specifically. So before we get into the actual thesis, we should talk about a little Civics 101 with what federalism is. So on top, we have the federal government, which consists of people like the president, the Congress, the Federal Department of Transportation, federal courts. Then we have the states, which is like the governor, the legislatures, the state DOTs, and the state courts. And then all the way at the bottom, we have the local governments like Madison, where we're at right now, which is like the mayor, the councils, and the voters, which just includes us. Now, a lot of times when we think about federalism, we think of it in a top-down approach, where what happens on the federal level influences what happens on the local level. And that is true, but it's just as influential looking at it from the bottom up, from the local governments influencing state and federal policy. And all these different levels of government are interacting with each other. And the rate at which one is affecting the other has changed over time. and it's changed with the development of passenger rail. The two are inherently tied. In the first part of our country, in the 1830s up until the Civil War, we had a very dual federalism system where the states and local governments were very separated from the federal government. And the federal government took a step back from things. And as a result, our rail network was very chaotic and not cohesive. It's hard to see on this graph and this chart, but all these different colors are different track gauges. So the distance between two tracks, like the two runs of the trains on the line. And all of these train tracks were different gauges. So you couldn't physically run one train onto another going through state to state. So a lot of times you'd have to stop at one border, get on one train and go to the other. And it would take days, if not weeks, just to travel from Chicago to the United States. So as a result, the system was very chaotic. There wasn't a lot of integration, and it really held the nation behind, especially in the Civil War era, when we enter late dual federalism. When the federal government had to take a more aggressive approach in terms of restoring the Union during the Civil War, it simultaneously had to restore and refurbish the intercity passenger rail network in order to survive the war effort. Because you couldn't bring troops from Washington, D.C. to Virginia or from Chicago to Virginia by taking different trains every day. So the federal government finally became a major role in the federalism dynamic and in passenger rail development. We built like millions of tracts of land. We gave tons of land to passenger rail companies to build. We created the first chartered company since the Bank of the United States, the Union Pacific Railroad, which connected the Transcontinental Railroad from California to the rest of the United States. And in this era, we see a lot of federal government involvement, and the size of the federal government expands, both in government capacity and in creating passenger rail in the first place. It comes to a culmination in World War I, when the federal government really takes over almost everything in an era almost called cooperative federalism, where each level of government is working side by side in conjunction. And this is where we see passenger rail reach its max. So this is the furthest extension of what passenger rail service looked like during World War I. We actually nationalized the railroads in this situation. So we made the system even more integrated and more connected with each other by getting rid of all the different companies and putting it under one single government company. So trains were running at incredible speeds and super efficiently. And yeah, it was quite a time. But this wouldn't last forever. Eventually, trains would have competition from air and car industries with the highways and airports, and the federal government started to look towards them as the future of development in the country. And as a result, we kind of come to where we are today. Federal government spends less money than it did ever on rail development, ever in its history. It's not supporting the industry, and it's deregulating the industry in general. So it's getting its hands off, and it's trying to let almost passenger rail die. And this is where we were in the 1970s. This is almost where we are today. Things are finally changing, but we're kind of in the same narrative. So in order to talk about today, we have to talk about three different parts. So first, we'll talk about the federal government, which a lot of times we see between like the organizations like Amtrak, which is the intercity passenger rail service across the country. They're in a state of, they're in a weird state because passenger rail is really, it's not a service that makes a lot of money. It loses a lot of money. Some lines lose $80 million a year. The federal government doesn't want to pay for that, especially a lot of Republicans in general. The people who actually created Amtrak saw it as a transitionary organization for trains to die out on their own. So they gave it very minimal funding. And that's where we are now. We're in a state where it gets enough funding to survive, but not enough to actually thrive on its own. And the way it facilitates this survival, and it doesn't get axed completely, is through something called distributive politics. So when we look at this map, there's trains all over the country, but we're also missing a lot of really big cities like Phoenix, Las Vegas, Columbus, Louisville. But we're going to states like Nebraska and Montana and North Dakota. And these states don't really serve a lot of people, but the people that they do serve depend on them very much for public transit. And Amtrak uses it almost as like leverage against congressional representatives and senators, where when they run a train through their area, these congressional people have to support these projects in order to, or they'll face major backlash if the Congress people vote for them to go away. So these Congress people give just enough funding to fund their own lines, but not enough to fund the collective whole of Amtrak. So that really leaves Amtrak in a suspended area where it doesn't have enough room to survive and thrive on its own. Then we can look at the local governments. The local governments play a role like us. In order for rail development to happen, it actually has to serve people, and people have a lot of say in what happens. There are a lot of people called NIMBYs, not in my backyard people. These people are opposed to rail development a lot of times. There are also people that support rail development called YIMBYs, but NIMBYs are a major deterrent for rail development to happen more often than not because they have a lot of influence and a lot of money, and they have a lot of time. They show up to town council meetings. They'll berate town representatives and town councils and let them know how concerned they are about these rail projects from happening, whether because of pollution, whether their property values are going to go down, whether for environmental issues. And these representatives take those concerns very seriously. And they also have a lot of power over the projects too. They can let their state and federal representatives know that these projects are not supported by the people. And a lot of times these projects are dead on site when NIMBYs get in the way. And then last, we have the state governments. Alongside Amtrak, there are a lot of state-supported services, and there are also commuter rail services, like NJ Transit is a commuter rail service that the state government organizes. But state governments in general have a hard time working with the federal government. On one hand, we have an issue with funding where both sides aren't very clear with each other about how they're supposed to fund it proportionately. It kind of makes sense. Both sides of the government want, like to get the most out of the other side. So they want to, be like, hey, you owe us like $1 million more than what you actually owe. So we're going to save $1 million. But they don't, there's no overarching organization that actually monitors what people are saying properly. So there's a lot of distrust. About a third of all state supported services organizers say they have no trust in the other side, which is not good for rail development to actually continue or to expand. Simultaneously, if states don't want to work with the federal government, they don't have enough money. They're broke. A lot of times they're in debt, but they also just don't have, a lot of states don't have the funds to properly create rail on their own because of the fixed costs. It's in the billions of dollars recently. It's always been expensive, but increasingly states are not going to be able to afford this on their own without federal support. So as a result of this trust and just not having enough money, the states aren't a solution to this federalism issue either. So the result of this, dynamic between all three is something similar to this meme where everyone's pointing at the other and they're like, you have to pay for this. No, you're going to pay for this. I'm going to pay for this. I'm not going to pay for this. And everyone's pushing the tab and the buck to each other. And it creates a really toxic environment and a really chaotic environment where no one's really leading. Everyone's trying to, defer to other people, and rail development doesn't really take off. You can to simplify, rail projects require all three levels of government in support to advance and finish, a direct consequence of federalism. We can kind of think of it like a Jenga block, where if you take one piece out, the whole thing falls apart. It all has to be together, unified, and supportive. But this is a major challenge to get actually all three levels of government on board. And that's evident in the case studies that I examine. So I look at three groups across the United States geographically in New York, New Jersey, California, and Florida. In New York and New Jersey, I cover the ARC project, access to the region's core, and the Gateway program, which is happening today. In California, I talk about California High-Speed Rail and Brightline West. And then in Florida, I talk about Florida High-Speed Rail and then Brightline Florida. So first, for looking at New York and New Jersey, we have the ARC project that happened in like the early to late 2000s. New York and New Jersey recognize that they have a major congestion bubble area in approach to Manhattan. It's very congested, it's very old, it's crumbling. And both governments agreed that they had to do something. So initially, there was federal support. They actually backed about $4 billion of the $8 billion that was required. The whole project required $8 billion in funding, which is a lot of money for both state and local governments and federal governments to provide. But the federal support was there. The state support was initially there, but then with the election of Governor Christie from New Jersey in 2010, he kind of pulled himself out of the funding and New Jersey out of the funding because they believed that New York and the federal government wasn't giving their fair share of the funding. So with New Jersey's withdrawal from the program, the whole project died. There was local support in the areas in New York City specifically, but because the state's support wasn't there, the project failed. As soon as Christie pulled us out of the program, it died. But a few years later, the federal government took this over in the form of the Gateway Program. Federal support came slowly. Both Obama and Trump were very slow to actually fully fund the program. Trump actually halted funding for it almost completely during their time. But during the Biden administration with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, they gave the project, I believe, around 10 billion, something around that number. The highest amount the federal government has ever given to a single transit project in the history of the United States. Really unprecedented stuff that the federal government was doing, and they gave their full support, and currently still do. State support was present even when Republican Trump was in office. Republican Governor Chris Christie came back to support a near identical project in the Gateway and gave funding to the project, about $1 billion, 1.5 billion to be exact. So the state support has been unwavering. And then last, we have the local support, which is also present. And as a result, the project is succeeding. There's the Portal North Bridge, which is being constructed right now. It's ahead of schedule and under budget. And the tunnels that are going to connect New Jersey to New York are being built as we speak. So this is an example of federalism succeeding where the ARC project failed under the pressures of federalism. Next, we'll look at California. Probably the most famous case of rail development in the country. California high-speed rail has been identified as like a boondoggle. We spent a lot of money on it. It costs $100 billion to build. We've given about $23 billion to the project, which is a lot of money. In general, though, the federal government has not really supported this project as much as it should have. This is a major project connecting two of the nation's largest cities, San Francisco and Los Angeles. The federal government really needs to step in. The funding has been present from the federal government, but it hasn't been enough. It's come in short spurts of a few $1 billion here and there, but it's not enough to actually sustain the project over time. The state government has supported it somewhat consistently. California also needs to provide more funding to this project in order for it to survive. It does provide about $1 billion a year to the project, which is a lot of money, but in comparison to the budget of $100 billion, it's not going to go anywhere. And then last, looking at the local governments, a lot of local governments in the area of California where this high-speed rail project is taking place are very much opposed to it. For some reasons, genuine, for some reasons, not genuine. Of course, there are NIMBYs that don't want the project in their area and have pushed people out, but a lot of local governments and local regional organizations have taken advantage of California high-speed rail's massive $23 billion budget that they currently have and try to get little things away through lawsuits, through agreements, and compromises. There are tons of lawsuits that have happened, which have been settled out of court that reach in the hundreds of thousands, if not the millions of dollars. And adding up these court cases over time has led to the increased budget that partly California high-speed rail has resulted in ballooning from $30 billion in 2008 to $100 billion today. So as a result, while California high-speed rail isn't off the map, it is failing and it is struggling to survive, especially with a hostile Trump administration that's pulled a lot of funding. California really needs to step up in their state support and wait till a better federalism dynamic is supported, where the federal government and more local governments get on board. But across the desert in California is Brightline West, which connects Los Angeles via Rancho Cucamonga to Las Vegas. And this project has been going on as California high-speed rail is going on. The federal government gave a lot of money, I think around $3 billion through the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So they paid for a bunch of the funding. Both California and Nevada gave funding in their own different amounts, but in the totaling in the billions of dollars. And then even local governments have been supporting directly, paying for the stations both in Rancho Cucamonga and Las Vegas. So as a result of all these different levels of government contributing and being supportive, the project is advancing very quickly. It's supposed to be under construction now, and it should be completed in just 4 years. So California High-Speed Rail has been going on since 2008, and it's taken them almost 20 years now to complete the project. California High-Speed Rail is just putting their dirt in the ground, and they're going to get it done in 4 years. So the dynamic between federalism working and not working is really expressed in this comparison. And then last, looking at Florida, there is the Florida High-Speed Rail Corridor Project. This was kind of created in the 2000s. It was one of the corridors identified by the federal government as, hey, we need this. There's a lot of traffic between this area, and it's a real opportunity for us to expand. And the federal government initially did support the project. They almost paid for it completely. The project's first phase from Tampa to Orlando was fully funded by $2 billion in grants provided by the federal government under the Obama administration in 2008. But the state government flat out rejected all that funding because they were like, well, you're giving this $2 billion to us, but there's probably going to be more funding that's going to be required, and that's going to come down to us. So we're going to be really cheap, and we're going to say no. So Rick Scott, the governor at the time, opposed this and flat out rejected the funding, which all but canceled the project. Local support in Tampa, Orlando, and Miami was present, but still the success of the project failed as soon as Rick Scott refused to use that $2 billion of fully funding, which goes to show how important the federalism dynamic is. Once again, the federal government can fully fund a project and kind of ignore the state and local governments, but the state and local governments could just as easily reject that funding and have to be included in the project. But a few years later, Brightline Florida was a new passenger rail service that recently opened about a few years ago, and they needed a lot of funding to start off their project from Miami to Orlando. The federal government provided around $1 billion in funding cumulatively over time. So did the state government, headed by Rick Scott, the same governor that canceled Florida High-Speed Rail, is supporting this. I mean, there's some issues with that because Brightline Florida is a private company, and Rick Scott has invested into the private company itself, but it's still playing out through the federalism lens. And last, local governments have given a lot of money to Brightline Florida through building stations, through rail development in the area. Each level of government has supported this project, and it's succeeding. It recently opened an extension to Orlando International Airport, and it's looking to advance its project all the way to Tampa to finish the corridor that was attempted back in the 2000s. So in conclusion, we can look at the failed projects and the successful projects side by side, and it's pretty evident to see the correlation between the two. Failed projects need, at least all three levels, at minimum, all three levels of government working with each other, and each failed to achieve all three. At least one falls out of line. And as a result, the project just falls apart completely. But when we look at the successful projects, all three levels of government are working side by side in conjunction as equal partners. And as a result, they succeed and they grow. And this is the key for us to understand why federalism is holding our rail development back and what we can do in the future to create rail development to improve to the 21st century. So thank you for your time. Yay. Amazing. And then last, before I close out, I have to do my acknowledgements and dedications. First, I'd like to thank all of you for coming on Zoom last week when we had this thesis, and all the people here today. Everyone in this room has contributed to my journey here at Drew. I hold you all so dearly, and I wish good luck for everyone in the summer. I'd like to thank my advisors, Professor McGinn, Professor Smith, and Professor Soul, for their support creating this thesis. Your dedication to this massive project has been so wonderful, and it's been lovely working with you all. I have to recognize Professor Jordan, who I started this project with in research methods last year. Thank you for giving me the encouragement and support in the first early days of this project. I would also like to thank the many transit researchers, government workers, transit YouTubers, and influencers who shared resources for this project. In particular, special thanks to Matt Bell and Jared Pelosio for their interviews and contributions. Also, thank you to Matthew Stefanowitz for allowing me to use his sources for my essay and for reading my very, very long drafts. Thank you for all my friends for all the memories we've created this year. It's been a really amazing time getting to know you all. In particular, thank you, Cam and Sophia, for listening to my ramblings about trains and always being there for me. And of course, thank you to Jocelyn for helping me with my thesis as we bounced ideas off of each other and vented about our thesis work throughout the year. I love you all so much. Last, I would like to thank my moms, Michelle and Lisa, and my brother Vincent for being there for me and for being there for each other this year. Despite all the trying times we've had this year, you provided me the grace and freedom to pursue this passion. You have each helped me get to this point, from sitting with me every day as a kid to teaching me how to speak, all the way to helping me with the laundry when I'm overwhelmed with work. I love you all so much. This year, I've learned the true meaning of family and how grateful I am for all of you. This thesis has been made in a very hard time for me and my family. In the span of a year, the entire time of this thesis being created, we have lost 4 loved ones, 2 of whom we lost just a few weeks ago. Just like millions of Americans, they relied on public transit to work, live, and travel every day. My grandma, whose birthday was last week when my thesis was originally presented, even survived the fires of a PATH train in the worst era of transit. Trains were a part of their lives, spending hours year after year, creating memory after memory, traveling on them. I miss them all so much. This thesis is dedicated to my grandparents, Helen and Gary Brennan, my uncle, Peter Mers, and my third mom, Radhika Raju. Thank you all for coming and thank you for listening.